Continue. Okay, so Steve Whelpley, S. Whelpley, is
Yeah.
going to be talking this week about just a variety of subjects I think you wanted to talk about and just sort of.
Well, I've loved how primarily the focus has been talking about technical stuff. And honestly, I think me being over a decade ago, an English classics philosophy major, I'm all about the technique. But I thought it'd be fun to switch it up. And thing that I've done with my athletes, I'd like to say that I did it religiously every week on a Tuesday, but I often fell off a bit. But I try to have meetings on certain topics, and sometimes it might be stuff really specific to our team. Other times it might be something more general, and it could be on a technical thing, it could be on a physiological thing, it could be on a psychological thing. But I wanted to just go through one of those with you guys and also use that as a talking point. So it'll be like a little bit meta in that basically I'm going to share a training zones talk that I did with them. But I'll also kind of reference as I go through it with you guys, like what we sort of talked about, why I had these slides, why it came up and stuff like that, to try to lay over it sort of the pertinent athlete information. So I'm mostly going to be screen sharing, so I might not have the chat right in front of me, kind of like the same thing that was going on for trying to remember somebody else doing it too, and to have that right there. So feel free to just talk over me if you have a question that you guys want to interject, since I won't be. I can alt tab real quick and get myself back. Computers loaded. Okay. So I got a couple things afterwards that I'll show to kind of augment it, including my what I currently use as a template. So, well, here, this right here is your part of my English philosophy side. But I had done this once on MLK Day, and I really mean no. I realized to relate anything MLK did to our privileged sport of rowing is like a pretty inarticulate, analogy. And I'm not trying to draw that analogy, but I do think MLK was an amazing, orator and linguist. And so he has a quote that I've substituted just a couple words for, and that's what was amazing to me. But power without technique, and I think I presented this on MLK, that's why I led with it. Power without technique is reckless and abusive, and technique without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is technique implementing the demands of winning, and winning at its best is power correcting everything that stands against technique. So the only two words that I changed throughout it were love, I changed to technique, and justice, I changed to winning. But I've constantly had somebody that I needed to persuade. It's usually the people that have the power on deck. To persuade them to have better technique is a really challenging thing to do. But then I also think I've seen people where they're almost massaging themselves through the strokes so gently that it's sentimental and anemic, which I thought was pretty amazing. But now that I realize that, it doesn't really go with the rest of the presentation, but I think I presented on MLK Day. So the first thing that I showed them, and can everyone just verifying everyone can see this? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. So this is something that started to strike me as an athlete, and then as I became a coach, I got more and more different terminologies. And actually, to this date, I have even more that I could share with you guys. But, going through this, on the far right, the GRP plan, part of me feels bad stripping myself of kind of more articulate or more colorful phrasing, but I just went Roman numerals, and I went 5 zones. My 5th zone technically has more than one physiological zone happening in it. But what's really interesting to me is to see across the board how it correlates and how people describe stuff or define stuff. And those are 2 different things. Description and the definition are 2 different. And that's a big part that I was hammering home to them. So I spent 3 years training with G-Man and Change. G-Man is Gunter Butter, who runs GMS in New Milford. Really great guy, really great, physiologist with roots, his roots being in Germany. A lot of these words are taken, I found out through him and other German coaches, that they're basically translations of how they describe it. So lowest zone is recovery. Second zone is compensation. Third is extended endurance, intensive endurance, high intensive endurance, speed play. Kind of as you read through them, I get that sense that they were from translation. But the other funny thing to me, and this goes with anything, but to teach like what those first two zones are on most of these plans can be a really challenging thing. Like technically, this is why you see Tom Terhar, so the Tom T with some anonymity. That's what Tom Terhar goes by, where it's A, B, C, D, E, and then he has a double E to distinguish when people can really go easy. The easiest, the most obvious or apparent plan that you'll see is Dick's plan, which doesn't directly reference AT, but I think he would lump it in with 6K, and that's where I'm saying the definitions are really important. But steady state, that's intensive, and then 6K, 2K, and sprint work. Maybe a bunch of you are familiar with FISA's typical zones. UT2, UT1. I always have to check myself each time. The one helpful thing to keeping the hierarchy between their oxygen utilization zones is they often write a UT3 zone now, which would be even, an even easier zone that's just sort of pure, just cycling, going through the motions, cycling stuff out of your system. So all of them, I think, take some getting used to. What I found funny that I was going to say before about G-Man's plan is like the intensity he wanted me to go for recovery. I was like, wait, man, I don't feel like I'm recovering. And compensation, just how that registered in my mind, like compensation means that I should be getting something. I was like, holy cow, compensation has me working like a dog. But you kind of learn those, and you have to learn those training zones. So I thought this is helpful for them to try to make them correlative across all the different training plans that are, some that are out there. Like I said, I know other ones too. I know coaches that started with the FISA plan and then augmented it. There's different people that have switched it now to, there's actually a lot of things happening on, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds with physiology. I mean, the simplest one is that we used to refer to it as lactic acid. And you really, when you're using one of those, meters, which that's what G-Man introduced me to, and one other coach before, and I frequently train with doing lactate measurements of my athletes. It's actually, you're measuring lactate, you're not measuring lactic acid. The acid and the lactate are two different things. And there was a significant period of time where like lactate was referred to as lactic acid, and it was considered this negative byproduct of working out. In actuality, lactate is a byproduct of working out that they can then be cycled again and used as an energy source. So I only mention that kind of red herring because people have even changed how they, talk about this verbiage. Oxygen utilization has been changed for some people to ventilatory threshold, in that you go through different thresholds. And I speculate that some of that change is because even though certain metabolic things happen in our bodies at 2 millimoles of lactate and 4 millimoles of lactate, it was somewhat inaccurate to say that like at 4 millimoles of lactate, it's our anaerobic threshold. I mean, yes, it's an anaerobic threshold. That doesn't mean that as soon as you're over 4 millimoles of lactate, that you're purely metabolizing things in an anaerobic fashion. Everything has a bit of a spectrum to it. So anyways, I put this out there to them to talk about it, but then I purposely show some of the complexity in it, because even though this particular slide makes it look as if everything's easily correlative, it then gets defined differently, how people define it. And I'll show something afterwards. I mean, in 2017, Jürgen Grobler gave a talk, and you can see his definitions. And like, I know by hunches that different coaches describe their second tier steady state, the harder steady state, different ways than me. mine is really modeled off of what I learned from G-Man and from other stuff that I've read, where basically for their second level steady state, I want to see them operating as close to 2 millimoles as possible, but under the assumption that if we go over 2 millimoles, then we'll be blurring that line between anaerobic and aerobic too much, that we won't get the full as positive of an aerobic adaptation as we would like. Again, during the course of a 60-minute workout in that zone, they're still going to be metabolizing some things anaerobically depending on the type of person that they are. But so I think that's a really interesting thing. You could say that you're comparing apples to apples. Like I might talk to another coach and be like, okay, you want it, and we both have an athlete in the boat. We might both say, let's have them go out and do hard steady state. And we say that we're saying apples to apples, but how we define hard steady state could be entirely different. This was just a classic chart. So part of this was for me to really, like, I have people each year. I have some people that are, intense physiological students, and other people that are like brand new to it that I bring onto my post-collegiate team. I've also shown a similar slideshow to the U23s that come in to try to just like put it in front of some of them. So this is a pretty standard chart. The heart rates are obviously extreme ballparks. The pace, is an extreme ballpark based on what boat class you're in and gender. And then even the percent of 2K power could get broken down differently. And I show them this to give them some broad strokes and kind of sweeping guidelines of stuff to think about and how to start thinking about their training. But at the same time, I also let them know that this can highly vary from person to person and from coach to coach on how they define it, like I was just saying. The thing that I think gets interesting, and this goes really, I'll show this similar chart from Jürgen Grobler afterwards. The more that you define it, it can be really, really helpful, I think, to your athletes. Like different athletes are going to respond to different things. Some love just being pace jockeys. Other love just abiding by their heart rate. But the more that you kind of prescribe different things per zone, I think the more that it makes it unique, and the more that you run the risk of somebody else defining it differently, but that's not necessarily a bad risk to run for more detail. And then through it, I don't know how much you guys, yeah.
So I was wondering about that is, just sort of from my own experience, it's pretty easy to be like, I'm going to hit this zone and I'm going to be hit this zone. And that, you get a bad night's sleep and you're prescribed this zone and you're just like not hitting it, or just things are out of whack. I found that with a, real numerically prescribed plan, there can be some just sort of issues with flexibility. Is that something you just sort of deal with as a coach and just sort of on a day-by-day basis?
Well, I think one thing that's challenging about the program that I'm running right now is that, one, compared to a collegiate program, the motivations are highly individualized. I'm trying to create the sense of a team in order to have it organized and operate efficiently, but everyone's here for like different reasons. And so the reason I mention that is it opens up this can of worms, like both the way I operate, the way that my bosses appreciate me operating. Like we want to have highly individualized training. So when you have individualized motivations and individualized training, it leads to like a whole spectrum of people doing different things. So literally I have some people that never put a heart rate strap on and they do everything by PE, perceived exertion, and other people that live and die by their strap. So I have a range here, but to what you're saying, those that are like stricter with it, I think heart rate gives you better feedback and more flexibility than if you just had pacing, because
Right.
If you're not rested, your heart rate's going to jump quicker. If it jumps quicker and it goes up higher and it escalates, you're going to wind up probably doing less work at the same heart rate zone. So in some ways it self-moderates. And that can be really helpful in the longer term. But that being said, I know certainly sometimes in the past, when I was training, where there were times where if it was just a blip on the radar, like if it was one night that I didn't get enough sleep or one night I was stressed out, forcing myself to do a pace, like as long as it was for a short enough window, could be okay. If it's something that goes from being an acute issue to a chronic issue and you don't make that adjustment quickly enough, like to either abide by what your heart's telling you or your PE or, whatever other feedback loops you have, then I think it can get danger zone quick. So, I do think heart rate can maybe bail you out of it sooner, just because if it goes up, if I typically sit down on an erg and I pull 2-minute splits and my heart rate's 145, I sit down and I'm pulling 205s and my heart rate's at 145. Well, then that's just where I'm going to sit, for the duration of the workout if I'm doing heart rate training. So in some ways that can really help you, but it only helps you to a point. Again, it might make sure you don't get buried, but if you have a chronic issue going on, or you really need to recover, then you gotta work with the coach and athlete, have to work together to definitely make a more significant adjustment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So I try to throw some of the general stuff at them when I do this, and I find now sometimes it's hard to remove yourself from what you've learned, and to make sure that you're still teaching. Everyone could be at different levels, so I never want to be too redundant, but at the same time, I also have found myself numerous times where I've sort of skipped over something with an unawareness that somebody else might not have learned it yet. So I really try to drive home the aerobic base, because a lot of people haven't done the volume that I might be expecting them to do. And it was once believed that a 2,000 meter race involves 70% aerobic and 30% anaerobic. Now it's more 80-20. I do say to them, this can range from person to person. If you're a more anaerobic person, maybe that, it's sort of a scale and maybe it slides. But the fact is, there's nobody that's going to do it 50-50. There's no one that's going to do the first 50% of the race, anaerobic, and then suddenly 50% aerobic. So I just use that as a major hammering home for them to basically realize the importance of having aerobic base. And the other thing that I really like and I sort of believe in is I think it's kind of interesting that for this all depends, and I'm not saying, I've seen a lot of collegiate coaches try to implement try to scale down a high volume plan to a situation where you don't have the ability to do high volume. So basically, what I think is really neat about this is a 2,000 meter race at the international level is 80% aerobic, 20% anaerobic. In general, my training plan models after that too. Almost always we're doing 80% stuff at levels 1 and 2, and the other 20% are levels 3 through 5, but I've seen a lot of collegiate plans where they're okay, we're going to start training like professionals and we're going to do a lot of low intensity. Well, when you only have people for X number of times per week and Y number of minutes in those times, I do think you have to reconsider that. It doesn't mean you're doing pieces every day and you're beating people into the ground. But at the same time, where you might ask them to get a more significant portion of their minutes might be if they do workouts on their own or something like that. You also obviously have limited timelines in a lot of situations to get people, gelling as a crew together and things of that nature. So while it says that here, I think sometimes it can be a fallacy that if people do it to a short season, try to apply the same rule to a short season, I don't know that it would necessarily be your best bet. Since I do a lot of lactate testing, I try to give them a little bit of background on that. So before training, most athletes have a lactate concentration of 1.6 millimoles per liter. Once they start aerobic work, the concentration decreases below 1.0. This happens on a lot of tests, depending on how they warmed up for the test. I make sure that they don't do powered 10s and stuff like that before the test, because my test just steadily builds into stuff. But if somebody's really fit and their warm-up was relatively benign and not that intense, you'll find it where the lactate curve actually starts a little bit higher for the first level, goes down, and then it starts its sort of parabolic curve up. That's really common. I ask the athletes to work at an intensity that requires a concentration of 1.0 to 1.5 millimoles per liter for the UT2, which is our level 1 range, and then 1.5 to 2.0 for UT1, which is our level 2 range, which you can see right there, that's why I always get confused in my head, and I always got to give myself the reminder that UT3 is even easier than UT2. These ranges are the result of experience more than scientific experimentation. The athletes can recognize the transition between the two intensities. So I have tested the ranges by asking athletes to train at what they consider to be their ideal training heart rate. And this is actually lifted from the same place as the last place, the human kinetics. And I've done the same thing though with my athletes. So if I have somebody that's cross training a lot, I'll take lactate samples on the bike to verify the different levels. So this is also from the same place, just to show them like a general curve. I give them similar graphs, which I could pull that up afterwards too. But basically, you know, you look for the 2 millimole, and I also look for the 4 millimole. And generally, if you find an athlete and you tell relative to the other population that you want them to improve their 2 millimole more or their 4 millimole more, well, for most people, doing work specifically at that target is what's going to improve that target the most. So for instance, if I have somebody who's got a pretty good level, 2 millimole anaerobic aerobic transitional threshold, if that's pretty good, but 4 millimole is not great for them, I'll have them do a lot of AT work, and that would bring it up quicker. Now, if they just increase the amount of hard steady state they did, that would move it too, but not as dramatically as doing work right at the subject matter of what you want to change. This is another way of viewing it. This is actually through a VO2 test where they were also taking lactate. We're lucky here that we have a VO2 machine as well, but I kind of use it differently. That one, the ski coach runs, and she's Bulgarian and pretty strict about stuff. So I let her run it. And I mostly use it for looking at respiratory rates and when that stuff switches over. I primarily lean, though, on the lactate as far as what I have them do for their train and to implement. And now we're getting towards the end of it. This is me also having to buy them that we're going to get a lot of these low intensity meters cross-country skiing. That's something that you can see us being up in Vermont as a negative, or it can be a positive. So these are basically a bunch of international rowers who all show how much they love skiing, and then I hopefully sell them on it. Got the whole German 8. And then I end with Howard Blackburn. So Howard Blackburn, if you guys didn't know, there's a Blackburn Challenge, around Cape Cod and stuff. Howard Blackburn was like a guy who wound up opening a bar after he lost all his fingers, but essentially he was rowing out in a lorry with another fisherman out to their boat, and they got lost at sea, and then the other guy died. He kept rowing till he got to shore, and his fingers were frozen to the oar when he got in. So there's that going for you. But anyways, the other that I was going to show you guys that I was referencing, this is the training matrix from Jürgen Grobler. I think it's phenomenal. He's got all the code is the same as the FISA code. He's got percentages of heart rates, which I think is significantly safer than having an actual beats per minute zone. Makes it much more relative to people. This is where you see it. This is what really interesting me based on the definition. I call UT, what he calls UT1, oxygen utilization, I call that my level 2, and I have that is the equivalent of his UT2. I want them to be just up to 2.0 millimoles of lactate in the blood for their harder steady state. And he says 2 to 4, which 2 to 4 for me is what I've always defined as the no man land, where I try to keep as much of my training out of as possible. I'm doing some right now just because we're doing base stuff, and that's where there's some transitional AT work happening. But usually I really try to stay clear of 2 to 4, and I'm either trying to be over 4 or under 2, just to get the most bang for my buck on the physiologics that I want to improve. But what I think is neat, and this is what I was saying, the more detail you give, it could be the better, but it could also be the riskier. He's got stroke rate even. He has percent of FISA best time. I just think this one's so, and then it's a session, it's so comprehensive, with everything that it has. So I think it's pretty cool. the other stuff that I was going to share a little bit with you guys is, and this gets hard because now it's behind. I'll show you what it looks like when so this is something I switched to. I started this when I first came here. I made this, and I did it with the help of one of the Nordic skiers here who was a comp sci major. This is what I use as my planning tool, and I'll show you in a minute. I don't know if any of you. I'm trying to just have it right neat, but it's hard. I was using Training Peaks, which I can pull up in a second. I'm not sure if people have interest in it or not, but Training Peaks was incredibly tedious, in my opinion, for putting my training plan in. I know that Training Peaks was designed primarily for triathletes and like remote coaches that regulate multiple plans, and they have a bunch of shortcuts. That being said, none of those shortcuts were as efficient as me using Control C and Control V to copy and paste workouts. So what you're looking at here is my master plan or my base plan. So each athlete that I have on the team gets a column here, and it goes across to all of them. And if they're not on the team right now, that's why it might be blank. But I'm switching this up in the next iteration, but on the left is sort of the base plan. And so that gives me a good ballpark of what's being prescribed in general as I try to periodize things. So you'll see my shorthand code, which I made a workout catalog, and then all these things auto-populate my estimate of what they would be in a zone. So for instance, like head race auto-populates 50 minutes in level 1. That's primarily warm-up and cool-down. And then some of the warm-up is scattered across zones 2 and 3, and then some of the work is in zones 3, 4, and 5. And I've done that based off of historic data that I have. And so it populates that. The other thing that you'll see is the column D, which is HAP score, which I did that kind of jokingly because every physiologist that I meet, like, or people that just get into the fitness world, they always name stuff after themselves. My middle name's HAP, so I was doing it facetiously. But, you know, like Pilates, Maffetone, Phil Maffetone named his training zone MAF. I just find it funny. But anyways, what it basically stands for is like a budgeting tool for me to kind of gauge the intensity of the workout. So I made another approximate production score. And so essentially stuff is weighted. Basically, I use the level 2, which is the hard steady state, as the bread and butter. And then I tried to proportionally scale up, and I started with the direct ratio of beats per minute, but then I had to make it a little bit more than that. And what I mean by that is I looked at my workouts I did and workouts my athletes did, and if level 2, like for 30 minutes, had this many beats per minute, I looked at the typical heart, numbers of beats per minute in the other zones, and I built it out. But that didn't make stuff nearly as weighted as it probably should have been, to be realistic. So then over time, I sort of adjusted the values. So when I'm just like planning here, I both take a look at what in each zone, so I can see my percentages of what's been done in each zone. I look at the HAP value, which kind of gives me a better approximation of like how tired, how shitty they might feel for that week, basically. So the cool thing about it, like what you guys are looking at here, is, I can quickly copy and paste, and like if I go over, here's Michaelac, whatever I put in for her, pops over to her training plan. So this is her personal training plan. And I have redundant columns, workout master and workout, because basically it's just a copy. So if they want to make notes or if they want to write over anything, they can do it in the second column. If they do it in the first column, it messes up the carryover from the other sheet. And it'll auto-populate their log, but then they can overwrite the log if it was significantly different. So I found this to be like pretty handy in me just like disseminating the information. I don't have, what kind of drives me crazy about it is we primarily use Garmin watches, and Garmin has a lot of protective stuff in their API, unlike Polar. So I can't strip data and just auto-populate these fields, which honestly, I want to make me getting the information that I need as easy and seamless to the athlete as possible and require as little as possible. So like right now I'm kind of lacking, and that's why I signed for training, which I close the so this is Training Peaks, and we're looking at another one of my athletes, Jen Forbes. If Garmin it easily cares with it, and of course going to have a hard time loading stuff now. But I just found it really tedious for me to enter in here, but what's great is it really does a good job of stripping all the data. I don't know if any of you saw it, like Greg Hughes gave a pretty good talk, and he's using Training Peaks with just a couple select athletes that want to get into the nitty gritty of their training during this time. But I'm trying to come up with my own scores. They use these fitness, fatigue, and form, and some people really like to say that they can kind of, read the rings of the tree in those three scores. I found them only somewhat helpful. This kind of the most helpful you might see them. The blue line is fitness, so then this has been declining, which isn't ideal if we were coming right up to a race. Your goal would be to have that blue line trending up, and that happens by a play between the form and fatigue lines. Essentially, you have a fatigue line above the form line to really kind of push the fitness up, but the rate at which you try to ramp up the fitness will give you good feedback on whether an athlete's going to get burned out, injured, or have some other issue come up. So there are things in Training Peaks that are neat. It's really good for just gathering and aggregating all their information from their devices, but I find it really kind of tedious to use. So in that training log that I showed you guys, I have new stuff that I'm trying to roll out that we're trying to do in-house, like using an RPE survey afterwards that's based on like the Hooper McKinnon recovery survey. And all this fancy stuff doesn't really mean that much because perceived exertion often gives, better feedback and more accurate feedback, and it actually lets the athlete sort of have a hand in it. That's the main stuff I was going to show. I realized I could also show lactate step tests if people had interest in that. Kind of heard if you had any questions on that stuff.
How many athletes are you doing this for? All this individual stuff like that?
Like right now, there's 7 people on the ground here. 2 more that are like full-time members of the team remote, and then I have like sort of some people that reach out to me and I do varying levels of stuff for. But the team in general, since I've been here, is somewhere from 6 to 12 usually. That honestly feel, I'm not gonna lie, and I'm not trying to be a martyr, but it feels like 100. And the more that you try to do, and that's why I'm trying to mechanize it more and more, as much as I can, because it does make it feel like significantly more people when you really try to get into it. So the more objective data that I can have, the better, but then also the more I can mechanize it, the better.
I love the organization, which is I need to be way better at, but it just seems like that's insane. I couldn't imagine doing that for a full junior squad that I have of like 5/8 worth of girls.
Well, I mean, I feel like, yeah, it totally depends, but I think I feel like there's three tiers that I've sort of looked at, and one is like when you just have, this is the program. If you're on this team, everybody does this program, and for most large teams, that's where you ought to be and probably should be. And then at the opposite end of that spectrum, you have like complete individualization, which honestly can be a curse as much as it can be a blessing. A thing that I think is really challenging that I mentioned early on is like people are here, post-collegiate athletes. They all like even though all of us choose to row every stroke that we chose to take, I often look back and I'm like, why did I never think of an alternate universe where I didn't row in college? I just didn't even cross my mind, but the longer you row, I think it becomes clear the more, personal choice that it is. And so between having that and between trying to individualize stuff as best as possible, it can become really quick that people want it to become more of an a la carte situation, pick and choosing what you want to do, which isn't going to be like the strongest athletic stance that somebody can take. And that's a hard thing to convince. I mean, I don't think that necessarily it should always be like there's one way and no other way, but it's interesting if people get the sense, like you can't break a 2K down. You can't show up at a 2K line and be like, hey, you guys want to race to the 1K? We'll grab a swig, take 10 seconds, and then we're going to race again. The 2K is going to, racing, competing is going to be out of your hands. So I think one tricky thing is like if you wind up having athletes that take it a little too much into their hands, it can be as much of a weakness as it can a strength to have the individualization. But the middle is what I was going to suggest, Connor, that I think I've seen some coaches do really well, and it's cool, is, you could use something sophisticated to distinguish different groups, and by sophisticated, I mean, it's like if you did some physiological testing, or it could simply be like the classic spectrum of tests that a lot of people do, where you look at their 2K, you look at their 6K at the simplest, and it's like, okay, this person clearly needs more power and this person needs more aerobic base. And then you could have these two spurs, and, when it's convenient, when it's manageable, you just say like, okay, group A, gets to do group A today is doing some power pieces, where group B, you're going to go on this like fun run or something like that. But I really look highly upon some programs that I think implement that pretty well, where you categorize your athletes in a pretty broad scale generally, and then you just make it to try to work in really broad strokes on maybe some of their weaknesses.
Yeah, we have to break them up just purely on the amount of ergs that we have. But it's interesting hearing the way that you describe it. There's definitely better ways for us to distinguish where we are with each person.
And I've seen that. I've seen it on all levels. I mean, I know. So I did 1 year at my alma mater coaching, and when I was there, we didn't do anything like it as an athlete. But when I was there coaching, we did a smattering of tests. Like we did a Wingate test. I don't know if you ever tried that one, but there's like a whole Wingate test is essentially like a 1 minute test where you record every single stroke that you do, and you can look it up really easily. But basically the point is to fly and die, but you're not trying to fly and die, but the point is maximal wattage you could possibly pull on each stroke. And some people use it as a 2K predictor, but even better than a 2K predictor is if they do a Wingate test and then they do a 2K and like it was way off from what the prediction was, you can really easily put them in a camp. I mean, there was one athlete when I was at Colby who could pull national team watts, like well over 1,000 watts, and he would crush his Wingate. And prognostically by that, he should have been going close to 6 minutes. And he was, over 6:30, and so we were like, okay, if you want this, if you want to be in the first boat, you got the power. Like what you need is the aerobic base. So that's an example at like Colby, a D3 school, but then even Nicole, who's on now, Nicole and I have been looking over an old program that she was on, where a coach did it based off of physiological testing that they did, and kind of had different categories, and I'm leaning towards that a little bit more, both so that I can get my athletes to team up. Like a downside that you guys wouldn't have, maybe you guys would have, I didn't anticipate this, but when I have my master spreadsheet that then disseminated each person's individual workout, and even when I was in Training Peaks, I once had an athlete who, like, I found out would try to find out everybody else's workout to know what they were doing. And the point wasn't ever to have secrecy. The point was to have it so like each person's doing the best thing they could. But they were so worried about what they were doing relative to other people that they were seeking it out. So it's not just for that reason, it'd also be for organization. But I think it's interesting when I put the description of the program in, if I have two people that are going to do the same thing, I plan to put some kind of code system in place where it's like, okay, you guys are in the aerobic group, so this is an aerobic group practice. You guys can team up together and do this together. Basically, so people can find workout buddies. So they also feel that it's like it's individualized, but it's not the a la carte personalized.
One sort of general question I wanted to ask you, I guess it's a two-part question, is like training plan, right, is relative to your goals. So like, what are your goals for your athletes and your program? And I guess part two of the question is, how do those change? Do those change throughout the year? And if so, how do they?
Yeah, that's a good questions. I mean, everyone's highest arching goal is to make the national team, and so as such, I mean, like, this has been a physiological talk, but that carries over to any of the stuff that they're doing. I mean, it's like I can't count the number of times that I've reworked the bubbles of what I think are pertinent to an athlete's success, but I think like the main bubbles are psychological development, physiological development, and technique. And then under those, you could have, under physiological, it's easy. You have strength training, you have aerobic training, you have anaerobic training, you have a whole ton, right? But I could even put under physiological mobility, or in balance and coordination and stuff like that. But so, as far as it goes physiologically, I'm trying to push everybody towards what I think is an international standard. And maybe that's something neat that I could show you guys. I'll try to pull up right now. Just give me a thing that I kind of strive for, and it's hard because like we have a mantra. I feel like at Craftsbury of one, really trying to preach that like you want to be able to be a small boat mover, and a small boat mover can move a larger boat. And we also want to disprove that you got to have a massive erg, but at the same time, your erg's got to be good enough relative to your body weight. Weight adjustment. You guys got to not judge the number of tabs. Fortunately, you can't see how many windows I keep with this tab. But so this is a thing that I made to try to help them guide their goals physiologically. Like, one, I shared this with them so they can come in here and most of the cells are protected except for the current 2K and weight, and then for both genders. And so, like, basically, this is using a weight adjustment program that Dick Dreisiger has tweaked and refined over time. And so, by doing this, they can see, like, basically their power to weight ratio. And it's adjusting it for an on-water time in the 1X, as you can see. A thing that I sort of did on my own was using that. I made this big chart, which I'd seen a similar thing elsewhere. And if you go in this top right corner, it's like as heavy as my chart goes. So you're 230 pounds and you're going 621. That would put you, if we weight adjusted your score, at 89.5% of the world's best time in the single for a man. Which, honestly, when I hear that, I'm like, hey, I should put some pounds on and just go 621, because that still seems like a pretty good 89%. Hold on to that. But realistically, and this is a bit arbitrary, like, again, it's sort of like I was saying with the training zones. The more detail you try to give, the greater risk you take. This yellow line going down is the line that I think that they have to be across in order to really make themselves viable. So you'll see these shades. The current world record holder for the erg, that was done for the men recently, he sits right here. That would put him at 101 and 102. So assuming he developed enough skill and ability, he could probably rival, what Robbie Manson did if he had enough skill in the single. The other one that you see down here in the gold, this was Henrik Stephenson, lightweight. So I put that on here because I felt like that was a worthy standard. And basically, to be a medal contender, you need to get yourself on the other side of this line, which is pretty crazy. But to be in the A finalist, you just need to be anywhere in that light gold apron. To be an average international racer, which might entitle you to like a B final, you need to be in the silver. And if you want to be a participatory international racer, nowadays you got to be in a bronze or this orange area. And when I cross-checked this with a bunch of people and I cross-checked myself, I was roughly 210 and 555. So that puts me like right here. I'm like on the cusp of silver and bronze, which by what I did winds up pretty accurate. And then I kind of keep going down to the elite club racer and so on. And I have the same done then for the women as well. I'm trying to remember the two different world's best I have here. And then this is the lightweight world's best here. So it's interesting to me by gender how it shifts a little bit, and you'll see like where I put the gold line is literally dividing the 99 and the 100%. And again, this is just like a really broad stroke, but I want to give them an idea of what they have to do. I mean, it doesn't help if I have a 180-pound guy who's chasing, the world record. That's not what he needs to do. Similarly, if I have a 160-pound woman and she's telling herself that she needs to be going 622, that's not going to be helpful to her. But if she needs to realize that if you're a 160-pound woman, so that's relatively light, and you can break 650, you're going to be knocking on the A finals potentially if you're skilled in a small boat. So that's one thing that I did. And I mean, to answer your question a little bit more directly, John, like as the goals have changed and goals have gotten reset sort of based on the evolution of the person to a degree. Our goal is always to have the, people striving to make the international scene and to make the U.S. team. But we've had people where at times here like made the Pan Am team, and going into the Pan Am team, and this happened just recently, they felt like that was just like a carrot that they were chasing and they weren't going to be satisfied with it. But then because of a lot of things that went on in their life, like that was like, it wound up being a great pinnacle for them as well. And Nicole is a Pan Am team too. But I mean, I think with everybody, like it kind of evolves. I mean, I have an athlete now who's like the oldest athlete on the team, and sees flashes of ability to go really fast, but also, is challenged by injuries and training resilience, So a little bit, we always have to kind of adjust as the person evolves. And it's pretty interesting how just with age and years training, how I've seen that change already with people,
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
I have
What's
a
that phrase?
question.
Oh, sorry. Go.
Oh, is that okay? Sorry. So I think I've been wondering about how you or other coaches account for like strength minutes when you think about, okay, keeping the 80-20 rule and trying to add in like how strength relates to all of that, whether that's like a bungee row or a strength workout in the weight room. Especially since to me it seems like a different fatigue level that you might think about, but just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, we talked a little bit about it. And I mean, If it was a bungee row, then I would definitely just count it as rowing minutes, and whatever physiological zone they were in, I would count it as, And if I didn't know right away, like what I think I would classify it in, then look at heart rate data of a willing person who uses heart rate afterwards and watch that a few times, and I think I would have it. So bungee I would keep as one thing. But the funny thing is, when we talked about Nicole looking at some of the John Parker plans and how he put it in sort of this middle level zone, which I felt like was a good adjustment. Sort of funny, I retroactively did that with some of my strength minutes. And I got feedback from a couple of the athletes who are more proactive about tracking stuff that they didn't like that because it threw off their numbers for gauging their aerobic work. So in general, I always put the strength into its own bucket, and I think that's best. But then the problem is, are you including that bucket in the total stress, total stress volume for the athlete? Because you should. And it's funny, there's some athletes, and you'll typically see them, it'll usually go along with sort of their physiology. There's some athletes that doesn't matter how they feel, they go into the gym and they like feel that they're recovering when they're lifting weights, and you shouldn't really question them on that. But then there's others where like having them go to the gym when they're fatigued is pretty much like a death sentence. So that's where I think, if you have an individualized training plan, that's where I make different calls. If you don't have an individualized training plan, it's still fine, but you still better just take into account what the overall training load has been, and not, if it could be jeopardize part of your population, then you probably shouldn't apply it to any of them, but that's my thing. I think you got to count it separately, but you still have to find a way to do it. And I'm not quite doing that because of that whole HAP score, because of how different the example I just gave, how different it hits each person's body. I haven't given it a HAP score. So like really, I'm not doing as good of a job tracking it as I could as far as total volume goes a little bit. John, on the training resilience, I see in the chat your question with that. I've heard others use that term a lot, and I kind of like it. I think you have to make sure not to abuse it and be like, as a coach, be like, well, this is the volume you need to do. If you can't do it, you don't have the training resilience. I think that you want to make sure you don't use it as a heavy-handed coaching justification for adding volume. But I typically hear it with issues with volume, but it also could be with issues with like too much AT. People will refer to it as training resilience. And in this case, I mean it pretty genuinely though, because like with some athletes, I get pretty creative with the individualization, and yet like we still, like I'm not trying to make them jump through unnecessary hoops, but I want to make them just jump through whatever hoops I think they can. If you go back to that training peaks, where ideally we're going to have the slope of the fitness going up slightly, not too steep because then it's not going to be sustainable, but going up slightly. Fatigue is up here for a bit as we're doing it. Form is underneath. When we get to racing, I let form come up. Fatigue drops down. It's, I'm not trying to make it sound weird, but basically the management is just like, we're trying to push the envelope. Like you're never going to get a physiological change without stressing the system. So if you want aerobic change, the volume has to steadily increase, and that should be like relative to whatever the population is. If you want your muscles to adapt, you got to put them under a greater load than they've seen before, whether that's by reps or by the intensity. And so I'm simply looking for those incremental hoops that I think will get people there. But if no matter how close I put those hoops together, and no matter how shallow I make the ramping of fitness as possible, if it still has it so that somebody can't succeed, then I really worry about their training resilience. And that gets me on a total different spur. But like the training resilience, I personally do think like weight training is something that can really help your training resilience. Some people, I've met people time and time again coming into a 2K and they're like, oh man, I just need we got to switch to more powerlifting now, or we got to switch to this. We get so much of what we need for the sport specific 2K, like through our actual rowing, that don't get me wrong. We periodize our lifting. We do different stuff as we get closer to racing, because I know a lot of people want that neurological sense that they've trained their muscles to be stronger and faster for a 2K. That being said, if you ask me, I think the greatest worth of strength training is to make you more training resilient for doing the rowing motion over and over again. Some of the stuff that was talked about earlier, why I'm having a mental blank on the Temple PT, your guys' Penn State friend. Helen, thank you. I knew it was an H and I was saying Heidi in my head, but some of the stuff that Helen touched on, I think is huge. I mean, like we're not an impact sport, which can help a lot of people, but we literally sit in a seated position and work like crazy. And so hip flexors get messed up, glutes. I mean, she touched on all of it, and strength training is one of the best ways to get triple extension, to get your full chain involved, to work on imbalances from side to side. And so, a lot of times, like a belief that I've come in and I wish I'd gotten sooner is that like hypertrophy lifting, I think, has a huge benefit. And now that can get defined different ways, but I think doing stuff that has a volume of reps that's around like 40 reps, however you want to break it down, 40 to 60 reps can be really good because it's a load that's not too dangerous on the body, but it's still enough to force an adaptation, but the reps are enough that you're really getting your body to think it needs to do something different than just survive the rowing motion. And I think that's ironically key to surviving the rowing motion for a long time. So strength training for a lot of people, whether they were born with it to begin with or not, like a like for strength training, I think is something that can help people's training resilience. And that's with some of my people that are most injury prone, they wind up spending more time in the gym than others do, So when I say that, like I'm thinking 40 to 60 reps per exercise, and that's broken up. You're not doing, I have done training plans where we do endurance lifts where you do numbers like that, but that's broken across different sets. So like often what you might see is like 3 by 20, which sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's still something that's manageable with a decent weight depending on the exercise. But 4 by 12 to 15 would be a great example, of something that I think can have a good effect on people. But that's talking to a lot of people, but also pretty anecdotal too,
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. I'm just like Connor. I already have the fear setting in, but like I feel like I just plowed through stuff that I thought I should plow through, and maybe it wasn't best. But I wanted to throw some different stuff out there this week just for fun, in case it was of interest to people. But I love us looking at technique videos. That's been an awesome thing with this platform. And thank you, John, for hosting this and creating it, man.
I'm doing what I can, trying to stay sane these days.
Yeah.
No, thanks a lot, Steve.
No problem.
And next week, Allison, we'll be talking, and I look forward to that. So I thought that was really, really interesting. I find myself putting out fires as a novice coach more so than worrying about training plans and physiology. But I think it's it's good. You got to stay on top of it, and I think you have a really good system.
Yeah, well, hey, dude, you're always putting out fires, so being a good firefighter is probably the number one thing to do, because I'm shocked at the fires that I'm putting out, even with adult professionals. So
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot.
all right, later, guys.
Thanks.